This channel is part of the History Hit network.
Some of the turning points of history just happen. Volcanoes erupt. Earthquakes, floods and fires destroy cities. But most of the turning points of history do not just happen.
This was their finest hour.
They are the result of actions taken by people.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Fear itself.
They are the work of those who use power, ambition, belief to shape events. People are the authors of history.
It's the curious thing about history that we all understand the great currents matter. The institutions matter, geography matters, economics matters, what natural resources you have matters. But I do think there are moments in history when it really matters who's in power.
This is the story of the people who, holding or reaching for power, shaped our world. The titans of the 20th century. At the end of 1943, the greatest war the world has ever known had traveled more than halfway towards its climax. Millions were yet to die, but the tide turned at Midway, at El Alamein, and at Stalingrad was running at the flood. And three leaders tasting victory met at Tehran. Three titans posed for photographs outside the Soviet embassy. Josef Vissarionovich Djougashvili, known as Stalin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Spencer Churchill.
That particular dynamic between Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill was, I think, very, very unusual.
Here and at the Yalta Conference in 1945, the Big Three will decide the fate of the world and its shape for decades to come.
Churchill did not like the use of the term the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, because he knew, actually, that it was the Big Two and a Half.
3 or 2.5, they were center stage. But other colossal figures in China, in India, were waiting in the wings, while more main players in the unfolding drama were aligned in opposition. Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, the Emperor Showa, known as Hirohito. They and Gandhi and Mao Zedong and Franco and Ho Chi Minh and many others were born in the age of empires. And they created a new map of the world. As our story starts, a world that endured for centuries had been smashed on the battlefields of the First World War. This was a world in which all the leading players had been born in the 19th century. Winston Churchill in 1874, Stalin in 1878, Roosevelt in 82, and Hitler in 89. Neville Chamberlain's birth year, 1869, was also the year in which Mohandas K. Gandhi was born. What they knew as children was a gaslit, horse-powered world. What they knew as adults was a war in which 65 million fought, 8.5 million were killed, and from which most, in Britain and her empire, almost 90%, came home. But not to a world that was gaslit and horse-drawn.
If you love history, then you'll love History Hit. Our extensive library of documentary features everything from the ancient origins of our earliest ancestors to the daring mission to sink the Bismarck. History Hit has hundreds of exclusive documentaries with unrivaled access to the world's best historians. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Timeline fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code TIMELINE at checkout.
In 1919, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin were already significant national figures. Others who will play a part in our story were completely unknown. In 1919, no one saw Benito Mussolini, an obscure journalist, as a future dictator.
Mussolini had fought in the war. He was lightly wounded in 1917, and so his war was shortened.
He was a young man from the provinces, not by any means totally poor in his background. The regime's propaganda would exaggerate his family's poverty.
Italy, though on the victorious side, had come away from the war with grievances. Sidelined, perhaps bullied is a better word, by her allies Britain and France at the peace settlement, she had, she claimed, been served a mutilated victory, and there was discontent and rising communism.
The Italians call the first 2 years after the First World War the 2 red years. And against this background, we see the gradual rise of a right-wing movement, the Fascist Party, led by Benito Mussolini.
He busied himself making a new newspaper because he'd been kicked out of the Socialist Party.
A paper called Il Popolo d'Italia, which was financed by rich landowners and by the French and the British secret services.
In November 1919, Mussolini made his first tilt at political office. He polled 4,796 votes. The Catholic Popolari received 70,000 and the Socialists 170,315. In his home village of Predapio, Mussolini did not receive a single vote. A little under 3 years later, he would be sworn in as Italy's Prime Minister. A rise to power that makes the ascent of Adolf Hitler seem positively lethargic. Mussolini's future Axis partner had fallen victim to a gas attack in 1918. In 1919, he remained in the army.
Biographers of Hitler always say that the army was really the only home he had ever had, at least since his childhood. It was the only place he was going to feel at home.
The army sent Hitler to conduct a political education course at a camp near Augsburg. He gave lectures on peace conditions and reconstruction and discovered that he was rather good at it.
He hadn't realized before just what skill he had as a public speaker. So that plus his passionate belief that Germany had been betrayed, they come together.
Following his success in the lecture room, Hitler was sent to report on a meeting of the German Workers' Party, where Hitler disagreed so violently with one of the speakers that he forgot his covert role, barking at the offended party who left in a huff. But Hitler made an impression. "We could use him," said party chairman Anton Drexler, a locksmith.
He was originally their PR man, and what he did essentially was emphasize posters, the meeting on the poster.
The thread running rampant through all the propaganda was that Germany had not lost the war on the battlefield, but had been betrayed at home.
A lot of what the Nazism he did comes across as a kind of protracted, bratish whine. They were actually planting this idea of grievance and betrayal in the German people, and they did it very effectively.
The Italians and Germans were not alone in resenting the Versailles Agreement. At the signing ceremony, one delegation had stayed away: the Chinese.
The government that was negotiating for China at the Versailles Treaty was a weak and ineffectual government. When word of that weakness reached the Chinese people, you had mass demonstrations that are now known as the May 4th demonstrations.
The death of his father had called one future Titan home, away from the revolutionary action.
Mao actually was in his home province in Hunan, in Changsha, in the capital city, where he was teaching history at a primary school.
So he misses the major event of his moment, which is the May 4th movement, which is the protest that happens after the publication of the Articles of the Versailles Treaty that most damagingly hand German-owned colonial territories over to Japan rather than handing them back to China.
In the post-war turmoil, every country, every Titan faced the same choice: to go to the right or to the left. Mao, of course, would go left. Russia already had, and Josef Stalin was a rising star in Soviet Communist Party ranks.
In May 1918, when arguably the country was at its most difficult time with starvation, Stalin is given the very important job of being chief food commissar in the South.
A man who would profoundly influence his country for much of the 20th century, not least by crushing communism, by going far right, was also gaining a reputation.
1919, Franco was beginning to be referred to in the Spanish press as el as de la legión, the ace of the Legion.
History seems to regard Francisco Franco as an almost comical entrant in the gallery of dictators. As we will learn, he was anything but. Few women during this period had the opportunity to make a mark entirely on their own. But some remarkable women, by any definition Titans, exercised power alongside their powerful husbands.
1919 is such a crucial year for Eleanor Roosevelt. It's the beginning of a new phase of her relationship with FDR.
It was a new phase because in 1919, it seemed as though her marriage might be over.
She unpacks his bags and she finds his love letters to Lucy Mercer. And she says the bottom has fallen out of her life. There's an appeal to start over again, and they do.
In 1920, Adolf Hitler was out of the army. He'd found his gift for public speaking and saw himself as paving the way, perhaps for someone like Ludendorff, effectively the German army commander at the end of the World War.
He thought initially, you see, that he would simply be as he put it, a drummer for Ludendorff.
Hitler was looking for a leader himself. He wanted to be subordinate to someone grander. Hitler only gradually came to see himself as the Messiah.
Nietzsche, whose philosophy Hitler commandeered and corrupted, said, "Whoever can command will find those who must obey." And Hitler learned to effectively command.
He found that the short sentence worked very well with an audience that didn't want deep intellectual arguments. They wanted slogans.
Nur wenn ihr selbst im Vertrauen und in Zuversicht. Hinter uns tretet an das große Werk der Rettung unseres Volkes und aller Selbst gelingen.
Italy too was beginning to feel the swagger of its man of destiny. Suffrage had been broadened in 1918 as a reward to the soldiers. The result was not a stable liberal government. It was an unstable shambles, which created an opportunity that was seized by the fasci.
Mussolini founds the fasci of defense and then the fasci of combat. And that's the first time that the word fascio, which comes of course from Latin, and it's a military term, it's about a protective move of soldiers, becomes associated with a movement, a street movement.
Mussolini formed his first band of squadristi to attack striking workers at Milan's Alfa Romeo factory in 1920, and power took to the streets. In an editorial in Popolo d'Italia in 1920, Mussolini wrote, "The Italian proletariat needs a bloodbath for its force to be renewed." Violence and instability continued in Soviet Russia. The Civil War would not end until 1922. At the 10th Communist Party Congress in 1921, there had been an indication of how backroom maneuvers were developing. In the election to the Central Committee, Leon Trotsky, founder of the Red Army, hero of the October Revolution, polled 10th, well below Joseph Stalin.
Stalin did all the boarding tasks in the party while everyone else was strutting on the stage, and suddenly they found he was in control, much to their horror, because he controlled appointments, he controlled recruitment, and so forth.
There were 14 unsuccessful candidates in the 1921 election. Between 1933 and 1942, 2 of them would die of natural causes, 1 would be assassinated, and 12 would be victims of the terror. Trotsky labeled Stalin the party's outstanding mediocrity.
Lenin had an extremely high opinion of him, which is why in 1922 he would make him general secretary.
It was a decision that Lenin came to regret.
Lenin actually changes his mind about Stalin at one point. He would go on and criticize him after a row, saying he was too rude, that he was, just too much of a thug, really, to be a leader of the Bolshevik party.
But Stalin now had his fingers securely wrapped around the mechanism of the party machine. In 1921, having left politics following electoral defeat in 1920, Franklin D. Roosevelt faced his greatest challenge.
He cultivated an image of a playboy who liked to party, liked women other than his wife, Eleanor, was often seen in their company, and then personal catastrophe strikes in the form of polio.
He went for a swim off the coast of Canada, came back, was feeling very faint, and then was ill and lost the ability to move his legs.
I think people don't understand the extent of his paralysis and how much it hobbled him and how immobile he was and how much pain he had to endure.
The disability transformed his relationship with Eleanor and her role in the world.
She supported him and what he needed to do, and he supported her ability to speak out and organize.
By January of 1922, Gandhi, already universally recognized as Mahatma, Great Soul, was leading his followers along the path of satyagraha, non-cooperation. And more than 30,000 of them had been arrested.
This was really the creation of a new kind of political mobilization. And I think it was the message of Gandhi himself, traveling across India, the message of his, as it were, his lieutenants, like Nehru and Bose and others, who went back to their regions, spoke politics in their own regional languages, Gujarati, Tamil, Punjabi, Bengali, and took the message of Gandhi, took the message of Indian freedom out into the countryside and beyond the cities.
Non-cooperation runs from 1920 to 1922, and he suspends it very early in 1922 because of a small incident. To him, it's not small. In a small village called Chauri Chaura, a group of demonstrators who were chanting Gandhi's name have a brief encounter with the police. The encounter turns violent, and the police are killed. So Gandhi believes that he is personally responsible for unleashing this kind of sentiment, and he worries that that kind of thing will lead India to a dark place.
In March, Gandhi was arrested and sentenced to 6 years in prison on a charge of sedition, which is to say, of protesting against British rule. By May 1922, membership of the fascist movement in Italy had swollen beyond 300,000. In 1919, it had been less than 1,000. Power was no longer with the parliament. It was with the gangs of paramilitary thugs whose violence bullied peasants and townspeople into submission.
Mussolini's propaganda bills itself as the solution for the Red Threat.
Mussolini confessed, "Our program is simple. We want to govern Italy."
Then it's not all that wildly clear as to how the Duce's great and wonderful thoughts turn into fascist policy.
In 1922, his ambition was to be satisfied.
The king and the liberals thought that if they brought him into government as prime minister of a coalition, he would calm down. Famous last words.
It was the hollow threat of a violent coup that frightened the king.
He was a very timid personality, the king. His father had been assassinated by an anarchist in 1900, and this had affected him a great deal. His mother, Queen Margherita, was so popular that they named a pizza after her. A writer of the time, Giuseppe Borghese, said, when he appeared in a uniform, it always looked too large on him.
The coup never quite happened, but it's written up in history as the March on Rome.
The so-called March on Rome in October 1922. They don't really get there, but they march towards it. It rains heavily and the maps are poor. It's not quite clear whether the army's going to resist them. And in the end, the king summons Mussolini to become prime minister.
Then he took a train to Rome, and he had black shirts stationed outside the city, and then they flooded in, making the appearance of an armed insurrection. But in reality, this was a kind of add-on spectacle.
Mussolini had to make it appear that it was a great populist outpouring of rage, which just took control of the state in a coup d'etat. That's not the truth, of course.
And why do I insist on proclaiming that October was historically a revolution? Asked Mussolini. Because words have their own tremendous magic power, he answered. On November the 3rd, less than a week after the fanciful March on Rome, the journalist Hermann Esser told a packed Munich meeting, Germany's Mussolini is called Adolf Hitler. Hitler had taken over leadership of the Workers' Party, by now the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and set his course. It makes no difference whether they laugh at us or revile us, Hitler said. The main thing is that they mention us.
And Hitler said, people will believe what you tell them if you tell them in a strong enough way. He introduced the idea of the big lie.
Accusing Germany of failing to meet reparations payments, and as allowed under the peace settlement, French troops marched into the Ruhr on January the 11th, 1923. 2 weeks after the French move, on January the 25th, 1923, at the first Nazi Party Day, Hitler said that the betrayers of the German fatherland must be done away with. He shouted, "Down with the perpetrators of the November crime." He was talking about those he dubbed the November criminals, the men who had sued for peace in 1918. In September, the world felt the first jolt of fascist aggression when the Italian Prime Minister sent his fleet to bombard and occupy the Ionian island of Corfu. Mussolini called the invasion peaceful and provisional. Of him, the British Embassy in Rome noted that he was a mad dog who may do infinite harm before he's dispatched. A prominent Englishman disagreed.
Winston Churchill, of course, made that famous comment in the 1920s that had he been an Italian, a very important qualification, he would have been with Mussolini from beginning to end in his struggle against the bestial appetites and passions of Leninism.
Winston's wife concurred. When they met Il Duce in 1927, Clementine declared him one of the most wonderful men of our times.
He was a mesmeric character, Mussolini. And Churchill, too, became rather addicted to Mussolini when he met him.
Hitler, by 1923, was making up to 6 speeches a day to a country desperate for an answer. Joseph Addison, counselor at the British Embassy in Berlin, wrote that it was as if Germany was marching with giant strides towards something very unpleasant.
Hitler was very influenced by Mussolini's playbook, and in fact, in 1923, he had his beer hall putsch. It was supposed to be his march on power, and it failed.
On November the 9th, Hitler, Ludendorff, and 3,000 supporters marched through Munich. Their way was blocked by police, shots were fired, 21 people were killed, and Adolf Hitler's revolution ended as quickly as it had begun.
He underestimated the legalism of the German people. Germany had a very strong civic state ethos. Trying a coup is something you do in South America, not Germany.
He was arrested, imprisoned, treated more like a guest than a prisoner, and took the opportunity to write My Struggle, Mein Kampf.
Hitler's working with this prison library in Landsberg and copying large passages from other writers. So he's citing Homer and Cicero, he's citing the Bible extensively, as well as Nietzsche and Wagner, all the great and good.
Hitler, you see, was a serial plagiarist in everything he did. So the whole symbolic forms, the rituals, the dress, the signs were simply lifted.
Mein Kampf was published in over 1,000 separate editions during the lifespan of the Third Reich. 12.5 million copies were printed up to 1945, and that's in Germany alone.
He's self-conceived as a mountaintop visionary who doesn't give explicit orders, he gives visions. And you struggle to interpret that vision.
Time magazine was launched in 1923 and first anointed someone its Man of the Year in 1927, when the crown fell on Charles Lindbergh. In the years that concern us, the magazine anointed most of the titans. In 1930, it was Gandhi. Roosevelt in 32 and 34. Haile Selassie, Emperor of Abyssinia, in 35. And the first woman, in 1936, Mrs. Wallace Simpson, the person without whom the King of England could not live. In 1937, continuing to be unorthodox, Time crowned the married couple of the year, Chiang Kai-shek and Soon Mei-ling. In 1938, it was Hitler, Stalin in 1939 and Churchill in 1940. In 1941, Roosevelt for the third time, and the following year, Stalin for the second time. In 1944, Eisenhower, he would appear again in 1959, Harry Truman in 1948, and in 1949, a second cover for Winston Churchill. In March 1924, Winston Churchill offered himself to the voters as an independent anti-socialist candidate. He was defeated. In October, he tried again, now as a constitutionalist, and this time he was elected.
Churchill was avid for power. He hated being out of office. He saw keeping hold of the British Empire as absolutely crucial. Otherwise, Britain would be relegated to a position of being like Sweden or Belgium or one of these sort of inferior continental countries.
In November, when to everyone's surprise, not least his own, he was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston had a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, 24 servants, champagne with every meal, and pink silk underwear.
Churchill's father had been Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he'd made a great fuss about the decimal points, which he called those damn dots. And Churchill didn't have much more of a clue about those damn dots than his father had.
Lady Churchill admitted of her husband that he knows nothing of the life of ordinary people. He's never been in a bus, she said. Events in the Soviet Union, linked as they were to the health of Vladimir Lenin, were moving towards a sort of climax.
If you look to Lenin's so-called testament as an indication of who Lenin wanted to succeed him, you very quickly come to the conclusion that Lenin didn't want anyone to succeed him.
In 1924, Trotsky wrote, "He is needed by all of them, all the sneaks that are crawling out of the upturned soil of the revolution. Stalin will become the dictator of the USSR." When Lenin died on January the 21st, 1924, an immortalization commission was set up, which, in contravention of his widow's wishes, decided to mummify the leader. He remains on display almost a century later.
If you look at photographs of Hitler and Stalin at party rallies in the 1920s, Stalin you will see cross-legged on the floor, sitting with the delegates around them, with his pipe out, chuckling and talking to people. Hitler is on a podium with everybody looking up at him. I think they probably wanted to see each other that way, and to some extent it does reflect something that was actually in their psyche.
On the 20th of December, Hitler was released from prison. He still had 333 days of his sentence to serve.
He comes out not a changed man in terms of his ideas and his hopes and his policies, but in terms of the technique. He gives up on the idea of a violent takeover, and instead he tells his party, we do it the constitutional way.
Goebbels, along with many others, said, "Is this the Führer we have been looking for? Or is this the Führer who is born to lead.
In Spain, the title they would fashion for their dictator was Caudillo, and the man who would don that cloak was very much on the move.
He rose to colonel very, very quickly. And in fact, by the mid-20s, he was a brigadier general. But that was the great myth. Franco's youngest general since Napoleon.
In China, too, a military man was displaying rare ambition, which is how many titans are made.
When Sun Yat-sen died, Chiang Kai-shek was the senior military leader within the Kuomintang hierarchy.
Sun Yat-sen had founded the nationalist Kuomintang Party in 1911 and been the young republic's first provisional president. His death left a power vacuum and a widow named Sung Ching-ling.
At some point in the 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek could see the legacy of Sun Yat-sen, his own position as the military leader, and the wealth and political contacts of the Sung family as being a wonderful triangle.
There were 3 sisters in the powerful Sung family. Sun Yat-sen's widow was the eldest, and Mei Ling the youngest. She will enter our story when she becomes Madame Chiang Kai-shek.
But Chiang Kai-shek would then use his control over the military to seize leadership of the Kuomintang within a year or 2.
In the Italian election of April 1924, Mussolini's bloc, by now dominated by the Fascists, won 375 of the 535 seats. They garnered more than 50% of the vote in the north of Italy, 70% in the center, and 81% in the south.
The fondness for dictatorship in Europe starts with Benito Mussolini when he becomes first Prime Minister in October 1922 and then actually fully fledged dictator in January 1925.
We think that strongmen leaders are evil geniuses who have everything worked out ahead of time. In reality, especially with Mussolini, who was the first one, there was no template for this. There was no template for destroying democracy.
In a speech in the chamber on January the 3rd, 1925, Mussolini dissolved the parliament and effectively declared himself dictator of Italy. Churchill, as Chancellor, could not understand the briefings he received from his own bureaucrats. If they were soldiers or generals, I would understand what they were talking about, he said. As it is, they all talk Persian. On April 28, 1925, he delivered the budget speech and, according to his own assessment, made the greatest mistake of his life.
He took the wrong advice, returning Britain to the gold standard, largely as an expression of political virility. You know, he wanted the pound to be strong, and he didn't get that right.
In 1925, Hitler commissioned his photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, to take a series of posed portraits of him gesticulating, perhaps to illustrate his virility.
He trained himself in the secrets of his room sometimes in gestures, hand gestures, head movement, but more specifically, of course, in terms of how he expressed himself verbally.
He jumps to his feet. There he is, shakes my hand like an old friend. And those big blue eyes like stars. He is glad to see me. I am in heaven. So wrote Joseph Goebbels in his diary. It was November 1925, and he had just met Adolf Hitler. In 1923, there had been only 71 Nazi groups outside of Bavaria. In 1925, there were 262, following the man who declared in Mein Kampf that Germany would either be a world power or cease to be. On July 4th, 1926, Chiang Kai-shek announced the Northern Expedition, aimed at unifying China, then fragmented with numerous warlords, under a central government, his government.
Amongst the warlords who joined the revolution and provided the main military forces for the Northern Expedition, Chiang Kai-shek was one who was able to unite the rest more effectively than anybody else.
And by combining political training, much of which actually came from the Soviets, along with building up his own constituency in the emergent nationalist military, he found himself a combination of political and military strength that enabled him to reunite large parts of China under his rule.
And this is one of those very little written about campaigns, but is quite extraordinary because there was this army which was not given much of a chance against the big warlords, made its way as far as the Yangtze, took Nanjing, the southern capital of the empire as it had been, and then Shanghai, which was the treasure chest of China.
At the end of 1926, at the 15th Party Congress, Stalin attacked what he identified as the United Opposition, and Zinoviev and Kamenev and Trotsky must have heard the clock ticking. Within a year, they would be expelled from the party. Trotsky would be exiled, and Stalin's grip would have grown more vice-like. In America, an army officer graduated in a class of 245 from the Command and General Staff School in 1926. He came first. His name was Dwight D. Eisenhower. 1927 was a year of activity across our landscape. With Franco,
the colonial infantry, the so-called Africanistas, are absolutely brutal. And the most famous of the Africanistas is Francisco Franco.
He was commander-in-chief of what was the most important and powerful military force on the nationalist side, which was the Army of Africa.
In the Soviet Union,
one of the things that helped Stalin's rise to power in 1927 is a major war scare, where the top Bolsheviks are convinced that a war with Britain is coming.
And in China.
By 1927, when Mei Ling marries Chiang Kai-shek, the Sung family were hitching their fortunes to a military strongman.
Sung Mei Ling, the youngest of the three Sung sisters, was destined to make headlines and enter the history books as Madame Chiang.
We in China want a better world, and we must have it.
Chiang Kai-shek was very clear early on that he would not allow his communist allies to become rivals. And therefore, when he had come to power in 1927, he brutally turned on his communist allies, first in the city of Shanghai and then in Canton.
On April the 12th, and behind the declaration that the Chinese Revolution must free itself of Russian influence, Chiang launched his anti-communist purge.
Chiang Kai-shek calls for an absolute massacre, and so everybody comes out on the streets and they are mowed down.
The Chinese Communist Party was forced into a few strongholds, Soviets, in rural areas.
And that's where Mao Zedong talked, debated, and frankly fought with fellow communists to try and work out what will be the next path forward.
Mao starts to articulate the philosophy that will become the gospel of his revolution and be promoted to this day as Mao Zedong thought.
His very famous 1927 report on the Hunan peasant movement, that he writes, look at the peasants. The peasants are the key to an actual revolution.
In Moscow, the Party Congress ratified Stalin's grip on power and launched the first 5-year plan, which would devastate the peasants. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries, Stalin said. We must make good this lag, or they will crush us. In 1928, a man destined to stand as tall as any Titan was about to re-enter public life. Franklin Roosevelt found relief from his condition in Warm Springs, Georgia, and by 1928 was ready to re-enter public life.
And actually, it was Eleanor Roosevelt who had a big influence on convincing him to go ahead and run in 1928.
They become a powerful team, and she becomes his helpmeet in a way she had never been before, and that is about getting back into politics. And that means much greater involvement in politics for her.
FDR nominated for governor of New York.
And so he traveled from county to county, incredibly extensive and grueling campaign. And he would be in the backseat of a car. He had an iron bar attached to the front seat. He would pull himself up, lock his braces into place. People would gather around and he'd say, do I look like a man who's not healthy enough to be governor of the state of New York?
The voters clearly thought he looked fit enough. On November the 6th, Roosevelt was elected governor. Japanese troops, in occupation of enclaves in China under treaty terms, made a move in 1928 which their government failed to support.
1928年に日本陸軍は満州の張作霖というですね、支配者を暗殺して、その機に満州を占領しようとしたんです。ところが天皇や政府から命令が出るのを待ってるうちに結局機を逃してしまうんですね。ですから1931年関東軍はその時の失敗に懲りて本国から命令が出ようと出まいと。
The Emperor Showa had not long been on the throne. In 1921, as Crown Prince Hirohito, he had sailed from his homeland to see the world. He became the first of his rank to travel abroad.
とにかく次の天皇が立派になってくれるように、やはり世界の大国にふさわしい君主になってくれるように、ヨーロッパを視察して、特にイギリスの国王からですね、随分多くのことを学んだというふうに言われています。一つのモデルですね、昭和天皇が自分が君主としてジョージ5世のごとくありたいというふうにどうも考えたようです。
After 6 months visiting Britain, the Netherlands, France, the 3 most significant colonial powers in Asia, Hirohito returned home to become regent due to his father's illness. In 1926, he became Emperor Showa.
あまり軍人的じゃないんです。昔からの天皇というのはどちらかというと非常に公家的っていうんですかね、貴族であまり軍事に関わったりしなくて和歌を読んだりとか、そういう非常に文化的な存在だったんですね。ところが明治天皇からそういう軍人天皇という性格が強まって、一番その頂点にいるのが昭和天皇。
In 1931, Japan's army in China again moved to invade Manchuria. How would the young titan on the chrysanthemum throne react? Perhaps the titan in the Kremlin, or the titan with the swastika, would make the first move. Or perhaps, in the year to come, 1929, the move would be made for them, on Wall Street.